By the end of this geometrynodes tutorial, you'll be able to create this text reveal animation in Blender. It will be completely procedural, and as usual, we'll break it down into small, solvable problems. Let's dive in. So let's first of all jump over to our geometrynodes tab, and really quick, let's get some text on the screen. So let's click the cube, click new here, and we don't actually need the cube, so we can just click the group input, press X to delete, but we'll shift A and add a string to curve node. Now you can drag this line over to the geometry or Control Z. Another thing I learned is you can shift click both nodes and press F. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Now let's make this string a group input, and we'll press N to bring up the sidebar here, and we'll rename string to text. And now we can input the text that we want here. So I'm just going to say Blender. And let's spin this text so that it's front facing. So we'll spin it 90 degrees on the X axis. And I can see that this is offset here. I want this to be centered. So let's go back to the string to curves node, and we'll make the alignment center. So now if we go to the front view, we can see our text. Now, depending on your design, you'll probably want to change the font. So to do that, you can click the folder button here and just navigate through your file system to find a TTF or an OTF file. And I'm going to do that now. Okay, so I want this Vipna Gorgiala, something like that. The Vip Gorilla font, and I'm going to load that in. And that is a nice looking font. All right, so the way that we're going to get this to slowly reveal over time is we're going to use a trim curve node. This will be one of the more important nodes for our animation. And right now, this is, as it says, a string to curve. So we're dealing with curves. Well, so we will be dealing with curves. Right now, they're actually instances, as you can see in the spreadsheet editor. But if we change this end, you can see how the text slowly reveals itself. So what the factor of a curve is if you have a curve, let's say it's just a straight line here. At the very beginning of the curve, its factor is 0, and at the end of the curve, its factor is 1. 0% or 100%, you can think of it as. If the curve looked like something like this, you still have 0 here and 1 here. So as we reduce the end factor, now there's absolutely no curve because the beginning and the end are the same. So as we reveal that, the entire curve itself is revealed also. So that's the main strategy that we'll take to reveal this curve. But I want to be able to add a glowing light to the point where this is drawing. So right here, a light here, a light here. So as these curves are filled out, the glowing light will move as well. Now there is a sample curve node, and this lets you get the position of a curve given a factor. But the problem that I ran into with this node, and it's in the Blender documentation for the node, is if you have several curves coming into this input, the factor will actually be the total length of all the curves. It's not an individual curve at a time, as far as I can tell. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. I would love to know if there's a better way to use this node. So I want to get the leading position for every single curve, not just all the curves. So according to Blender's documentation, that's not going to work. What I want to do is be able to get a point for each curve that's being drawn in. But a way that we can work around that is we can use the repeat zone. We're not doing a lot of computation here, so we shouldn't have too many performance issues because this is a serial loop, I've since learned. But until Blender gives us a for each loop, this will have to suffice for now. So what we want to do is we want this geometry to come in and loop through this repeat zone. And for every spline, we're going to calculate the position that we should put that glowing point on. So how many splines do we have? Well, right now we have 7 instances, but this correlates to each letter in this string, there being 7 letters. But you can see that if we play with the trim curve, there's actually several curves here. Some of these inner pieces are their own spline as well. So we need to work not with instances, but instead we need to work with splines. But before we add that in, if we actually bring in a curve to mesh node and give this a bit of a profile, we'll say a circle curve with resolution of 4, radius pretty low, 0.01, 0.015 maybe. If you were to realize these instances, it actually breaks the outline. I don't know why it's doing that. So instead, we won't realize the instances going into this repeat zone. We'll just branch off. I'll Alt drag this away so it doesn't break the connection. We'll plug this geometry into the realized instances here, and we'll just use the domain size node to get a count of how many splines, how many curves we now have. That will inform the repeat zone how many times it needs to loop. And that will, of course, depend on the font and its style. So now that we have this repeat zone set up, we can start to loop over every spline, figure out the point that we want to add our glowing orb to. We also need a way to track which number we're on. And to do that, let's set up a new input for this repeat zone. Let's change this to an integer, and we're going to rename this to index. And the index will start off at 0. We'll pass that value all the way through the loop, but then we want to make sure that we increment it by 1. So this will allow this count to go from 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. And I'm just going to F2 this and call it index plus equals 1. So now we need to do some calculating for every spline. We'll take this geometry and we want to, again, sample that curve. We want to figure out what that position is here. But which spline are we working with? Well, we can actually select or separate the geometry to get the spline at our index, not the index for all of them. We want to say the index that equals this index. So we'll say the integer that equals this integer. And maybe I'll just move this down. This index comes in here. So this is saying, let's get the one spline that has the index that we're currently looping on. And we will sample that spline to get its position. Let's make a bit of room here. So what do we do with the position? Well, we can bring in a points node of count 1. We'll take that position, plug it into this position, and that will generate a single point at that position. Now what we want to do though, is we want to start collecting these points into a separate geometry stream. So let's make another input output here in this node. We'll add it here. We'll say of type geometry. We'll just add it. We'll move that up so it's geometry next to geometry. And we'll call this points. So this line, again, we want this to be passed through the loop. So we'll connect those. But we'll take this point and we will join it to this geometry stream here. So we'll plug that in here. So now every time it loops, each additional point will be added to that geometry stream. It won't be collected on the main geometry line. It'll be separate. So it'll be easier for us to use later. So now I think that's all we need for the loop. We've calculated each point for every spline. So now if we take a join geometry here, but before we do all this curve work over here, we can bring on an instance on points, and we'll take those points to plug in there. And the instance that we'll use will just be a point for now. And if we plug that in over here, we end up with just 1 point here. Okay, something's wrong. So we've got this info icon here, instances in input geometry are ignored. Okay, so something's gone awry. This one's lit up too. I didn't see that earlier. Same error message. So it's complaining about instances. I think we need to just realize the geometry. So Shift D and bring this over here. There we go. So we need to realize instances before we separate. Oh, that makes sense. Because we're working with instances coming into this repeat zone, but we need to promote it up to a spline. We need to go from spline. We need to go from instances to spline here. So now it can actually select the spline that we need. So now we see all of these points on each individual, it looks like each individual spline. So now if we were to adjust the factor here, we can see that those points are moving around. So this factor here on the sample curve, that factor needs to be in sync with the trim curve here so that they're in lockstep. So I think that's perfect timing now to actually introduce the animation driver. So we need to be able to connect these two factors. So about in the middle, I'm going to say, let's bring in a math node. Let's set it to divide. And this will be our progress of the animation. Again, this will be procedural, so no keyframes, but we want to be able to specify the duration of this animation. In my case, I'll probably make it about 3 seconds, but let's make that a group input so we can adjust it later as needed. Again, press N to pull the sidebar, come here and say duration. Float is fine. Let's say the default's maybe 2, and I'll have to change this up here to, I want 3 seconds. So we've got this duration, but if we take the actual scene seconds and Control H to collapse that, now we have however many seconds in we are with playback divided by the total seconds of the duration. So if we're at 0 seconds in playback, then it's 0 over 3, it's 0%. If we're at 3 seconds of our 3-second playback, then it's 3 over 3 is 1, so 100%, so our factor is 1. So this needs to be shared over here to this factor here. This might get messy. Maybe I'll just bring this a little more in line, and then press N to get a bit more space. Hopefully you can see this on the screen. Nodes are getting a little small here. This has to come over here. Okay, and press Shift and right click, drag over that line, just to straighten it out a bit. Now if we hit play, you can see the dots move as the lines are being drawn. Awesome, that's looking pretty sweet. So instead of points now, let's actually change these to be icospheres. So Shift A, bring in icosphere, set that mesh to the instance, and we'll bring the radius down quite a bit, holding Shift and sliding that to, we'll probably tweak this later, but 0.02 for now. That's probably okay. Let's change the subdivisions. 2 or 3, maybe just 2, because this will be glowing. No, actually 3. Let's do 3. And speaking of glowing, let's add some materials here. So it starts to look a little bit more awesome. So we've got some lines here. Let's maybe pull this. Let's pull that down. Let's pull this up. So this geometry line will be for our spheres, and this geometry line will be for the text outline. So let's just add a material, a set material. Shift D, bring that down. And let's jump over to shading, go into the front view. I'm going to change the world opacity to 0. And let's actually use the scene world and scene lights, not the light. Let's hide that light. In fact, let's just delete the light. Press X. Okay, so we need to set up 2 materials here. The first will be, we'll call it outline. And let's just keep it simple. Press X to delete the principled BSDF. We'll bring in a emission shader and plug that to the surface. Give it a strength of 20. Material preview. Oh, of course, we need to go to the geometry nodes, change this to be outline, and we'll go back to shading, and we'll make in slot 2, we'll make another material. We probably just could have copied the other one, duplicated it, but let's add this emission. This one will be white, and we'll say this one's about 30. We'll call it orb, and let's go back to the first one. Let's give this some color just so we can see the difference. We've got color, but there's no bloom. We're in Blender 4.2, so we'll go into the compositing tab here, click use nodes, some space there, Shift A, bring in a glare, connect that there, and then we'll set the quality to high, but we want to change it to bloom. And I think, let's change this to 3D viewport, go to the front, press C to go to material preview. And to see the compositor effects, we need to go to this drop down and click always. So there's our bloom. It's pretty strong. Let's go to scene world. We'll change the, while we're here, let's just go to the scene world tab here. Change the color to like a dark blue, but then dial the strength down to maybe like 0.2 and Alt Shift Z to clear all of the overlays here. And that gives us our bloom. So let's turn that down quite a bit and maybe set the mix to 0.9, and we can adjust a little bit more. That's pretty good. You can always play with the threshold. This is all just a matter of taste, personal style. But let's give it that gradient effect. Let's go back to shading, and here too we'll have to set this compositor to always and clear the overlays. Let's give it that gradient. So if we Shift A to bring in a texture coordinate and a color ramp, we want to select our colors here. We'll say like an orange, like a Blender orange to a gradient blue, and we'll use, I think, generated, but we want to just separate out the, is it Y? It is Y, probably because it's rotated on the X-axis, but we want to separate out just the Y coordinate. So as that goes from bottom to top, we go from orange to blue. All right, so that's looking pretty cool. We just need to go into the Geometry Nodes tab and set our orb here. And we can see the material here, go into Compositor, set always, overlays, and scene world. Pretty fancy. This can all, of course, be tweaked as far as the bloom, the colors. Let's go to the render tab here. Scroll down to the very bottom. There's this color management. Let's try playing with the feel. Punchy's pretty nice. Very high contrast. That's really nice. I like that. It gets rid of a lot of the glow. There's a lot of extra glow from the bloom, but if you increase the contrast, you still get the glow, but the colors are more vibrant as well. So that's looking nice. Although the world, that blue's not really coming through because of the higher contrast. So let's bring that strength up just so we get like, not black, but just a hint of that dark blue. I think that's good. So let's play this back. You can press Shift left arrow key, press Shift left arrow key, or the right arrow key to jump from the beginning to the end of the animation. We should also consider the timing of this. Right now, if we go to the output tab, it's set to 24 frames per second. I'm just going to change that to 30. And because we set the animation to be 3 seconds, that means that we need 90 frames. So our end should at least be 90 frames, but I do want an extra second, we'll say, at the end of the animation. So we'll change this from 90 to 120. And if you're ever doing math, you don't have to do it in your head. You can just say, well, my project is 30 frames per second and I want 4 seconds, and then hit enter and it'll do it for you. So now, actually, let's change start from 0 and change our frame to 0. So here's a problem. We've got the orbs still there. I want those to actually fade in over time. So what we can do is maybe this icosphere here, let's say we have a group input, press N to pull that up. We'll say orb radius and 0.2, let's leave it at that. But let's use the timing of our animation, this same value here. Let's use this to drive the radius of the orb. And let's pull in a color ramp so that we can specify what the growth of this radius should look like. So that's going crazy up there. Well, let's fix that right away. Let's instead disconnect this radius, bring this over here. This color ramp is going to output values between 0 and 1. So let's bring in a math node here. We'll say the radius that we want, which is 0.02, times 0 through 1. And we need our animation progress to drive this color ramp. So now we don't see anything here, but if we right arrow a frame or two, we can see that it actually comes in, which is perfect. We don't see it at the very start. But let's change what this looks like because I also want it to fade out over time. So let's add 2 more colors here. This should be full on white. This should be black, which means 0, so it'll be times by 0, so no radius at the very end of this transition, at the end of the animation, and then this will be 1. So we can tweak this, which I'll probably do on time lapse, to the point where you like how the orb is scaling in and then scaling out. So let's give that a shot. Sometimes doing these projects, it can get a little tedious trying to find the particular settings that you want. But I think that looks pretty good. But here's another issue that we'll need to fix. We've got this curve that at the end of the animation, it's not actually connected properly. The orbs aren't there anymore. They scaled out to 0, but it's no longer connected. And that's because if we go over to this trim curve, for some reason, I don't know if this is a bug, or if it's a feature, if it's intended, but this trim curve just being active, even though it's the factor is set to 100%, it still makes this disconnect in the outline. So if we mute this curve by pressing M, you can see that it fully connects again. Thankfully, there's an easy fix to disable this trim curve. We can just bring in a compare node and we'll say less than. So we want to trim everything in this curve as long as the scene times seconds is less than our group input duration. If it is, we'll use the trim curve node, but as soon as our duration is hit, it'll deactivate this node and it'll fix the disconnect. So let's set this actually for now to be just 90, because that's the end of our 3 seconds. So if we go to 90 frames, you can see there that it's reconnected, but any time the animation is still going, it's still using the trim curve. There's a bit of a jump at the end, but if you look at it far enough away, where you'd probably be rendering, you don't really notice it. Let's change this to 120, just so that it doesn't immediately loop. So there's the last, frame 89, and then frame 90, it's totally connected. So again, I don't know if that's a bug or a feature, or if there's a better way that I should be using it. Again, if you are more familiar with it, let us know in the comments. I think it'd help everybody out. All right, so this is looking pretty sweet. Go to start and play it one more time. So as cool as this looks right now, it's a little bit dull because the animation is totally linear. So I want to give this a bit more energy, and it's easy enough to do because we have this group of nodes here, which again is driving. Maybe we'll make a group, Control JF2, and call it progress, which is from 0 to 1. And this drives the animation linearly. It goes straight from 0 up to a value of 1. But we can tweak that. I mean, I kind of gave you a hint that we have that ramp from 0 to 1. So we can tweak the timing of this animation just by bringing this float curve and then adjusting what that line looks like. So we can give it a bit of an ease in and a longer ease out. And that will change, if you look up at the 3D viewport, it will change the feel of this animation. Let's just change the end to 90 so we don't have that 1 second tail. But you can see now that it slowly ramps in, speeds up, and then eases out, which I think looks a lot better than just linearly. We can mute the node just to see the difference. And maybe that's the effect you're going for, which is totally fine. It's all a matter of personal preference or what you might be doing for a client and what you want or what somebody else wants as far as their animation goes. So that's really sweet. Now there's another thing that I want to show you which can push this even further, and that's with this character spacing input and this scale input. And I mean, the sky's the limit as far as what you can do. You can tweak this however you like. You can find different values to drive. You can just go crazy with it. But what I want to show you is if we take this same value, let's bring it over here and just drop it onto a reroute. If we take the same value and drive the character spacing from 0 to 1, now you get this kind of separation. Now it's a little bit slow, and actually if we have a tail, it'll push it beyond 1. So let's add in a math mix node, and we'll want this to drive the factor so that we go from 0 to 1. So now at the start of the animation, they're all together, and then by the end of the animation, they're fully separate, which gives it just another dimension of movement, which I think looks really cool. And another thing you can do to give it yet another dimension is you can play with this scale. This is the transform geometry scale. We use this to rotate the text on the x-axis, but we can also use it to scale this text. So if we take this same factor, let's plug it into a mix vector mix. Hold on. Shift A, mix vector. There it is. And you can see right here, if I were to drop it, it would try to connect to this line. I don't necessarily want that. It might be in the wrong input. So I'm going to hold Alt. If you hold Alt, you can drop it on top of a line without it auto-connecting. So now let's take that result, plug it into the scale. Let's use the same timing here to drive the scale from 0 to 1. And if we play that, that might not be what we want with the two of them together. Actually, let's give it maybe 0.8. 0.8 to 1. I'm not sure I like that. So while editing this video, I realized my mistake. I took the output from the progress frame and plug that in. So that's a linear animation again. I should have actually been driving these two mix nodes with the float curve output instead. That would have made the animation much better. So I'm going to delete the characters, or I'm going to deactivate the character spacing by Alt, Control, right click, drag. We'll just disable that line without disconnecting it. And let's see what it looks like. That's a bit better. I like that subtlety, but let's maybe knock this back to 0.7. And same thing, let's take this float curve, Shift D, and drop it on that line there. This is getting kind of a mess over here because we have to reach all the way back, but let's take this out so it's not an ease in, but the scale is an ease out. I think I like that a lot better. This orb size is a little bit too big, so let's knock that back to 0.15. I think that's a bit better. It's a little bit bigger than the line itself, which I think I prefer. And I do want to point out that for some of this text, depending on the font, some of these lines can get kind of narrow. I don't know a workaround. If you do know a workaround how to make this more even, let us know in the comments. That'd be a great help. I think that might just be kind of the nature of curves when you give it a profile. All right, we're pretty much done. Let's actually set this up to render. Let's go to the layout tab. Let's click this camera. I want to position the camera more in the center. So Alt G to move back to the center and Alt R to clear its rotation. But now let's press R and X and 90 to rotate it on the X axis. So now it's going to point right at our text. Right, the camera's right against the text. So let's press G and Y and just move that back just a bit, just to give it some separation. And then go back to the view camera. And now we'll change this orthographic scale. But before we zoom it, because we have that zoom effect, let's go to the very end of the animation so we know how it's full scale by the end. And we can zoom that in however much we want, maybe there. And I want to see some composition guides to make sure this is centered. So go to the viewport display dropdown, and there's the composition guides dropdown. Let's do the center, and you can see it's pretty subtle, but in the viewport you can see this dashed line through the vertical and horizontal centers. So now if we go back to the top here, we have the Shift X and Y. I'm going to shift the camera around a little bit just to get this text centered. And I think that looks pretty good. All right, press Z to go to rendered. And as always, go to always to get our bloom back. That looks so cool. We're almost ready to render. Let's go to the compositing tab, and I don't know if there's anything necessarily we need to change. We can Shift A and maybe drop in a hue saturation and bump the saturation a tiny bit. I don't want it going into the red, but 1.1 sounds pretty good to me. And maybe also bring in a brightness and contrast, and you can just play with these values to see if it makes any difference that you like. It may or may not. I think that looks pretty good. I can still see a bit of blue in the background. The blur is not too big. The saturation looks pretty good, but I think I'll go into the shading, click blender there, and I want to just flip this ramp, flip the color ramp. I want the orange to be first and then blend to blue, but I do want a bit more orange. So let's drag this over to increase the amount of orange. And I think that's nice. Back to layout. Okay. So let me show you how to render this. Let's go to the render tab here. Click. Eevee's fine. I don't think there's too much we need to change here. So let's go to the output tab. I want to output at 1920 by 1080. That's the resolution of this video. But I want to change the file format to FFmpeg. And we'll change the encoding down here to Matryoshka. H.264 is good. And I'll change this to perceptually lossless. And I think that should be pretty good there. All right, so to render the actual animation, go to the render menu and render animation. So I hope you enjoyed the tutorial and learned a lot from it. If you need clarification on anything, let us know in the comments so we can help you out. And if you want to learn more text animations with geometry nodes, check out this other video. Just click and happy learning.